Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Dennis Reardon, president of Connecticut Audubon Society. Welcome to this evening's program, Integrated Tick and Tick-Borne Pathogen Management Research in Connecticut. Connecticut wishes to honor the indigenous communities native to the chapter area, including the Pagusset, Wepawag, Quinnipiac, Totocket, Monunketuk, and Hammonasset people. As we advocate for the conservation of the land and its wildlife, we're indebted to the work of Native and Indigenous people who cherished the land for thousands of years before European colonization. A few upcoming events. Wednesday, February 26th, Wild Stories from the History of Bird Migration Research. Tuesday, March 11th, program on the Connecticut National Estuarine Research Reserve. And Wednesday, March 15th, Bird Friendly Maple. You can sign up for those on the website. That's March 25th for the Bird Friendly Maple. Scott Williams is head of the Environmental Science and Forestry Department at the Connecticut Ag Station. His recent research is investigating tick and tick-borne pathogen management, specifically the impacts of medicating white-footed mice and white-tailed deer, similar to treating pets against fleas and ticks. Welcome, Scott.
All
Thanks for
right.
being here.
Thank you for having me. Um, I should start. I love giving talks. I should start with this, but I find Zoom incredibly awkward. So there's no audience feedback, and I'm just talking to the computer. So I don't know if I'm doing well or totally bombing. But anyhow, we'll try to soldier through this. I see we have quite a few participants. Um, but thank you. Yes, I live in Guilford. I see a lot of Guilford representation in the chat, so that's great. And I'm a wildlife biologist by training, so I do a lot of research now with ticks and tick-borne disease ecology and public health. But wildlife play a huge component um, in the tick-borne life cycle and disease transmission or pathogen transmission and so forth. Um, so what we're trying to do right now is integrate and use these wildlife hosts, as Dennis mentioned in the intro, to interrupt the tick life cycle. Um, we know the tick ecology quite well. We know when the various stages of tick are going to be feeding on the various animals, at what time of year and so forth. So if we can target those animals at that time of the year when ticks are feeding on them, we can reduce pesticide use. We can have a very targeted approach and hopefully impact ticks area wide in like on the neighborhood scale. So a lot of folks you can do tick management in your backyard and you can hire a company to spray, or you can spray yourself, or you can do other things in your yard and you will benefit from that, but your neighbors will not, your neighbors down the road will not. So it's really an individual a choice to benefit. Whereas mosquito control, because they're airborne largely, some of those efforts can be seen for better or for worse, at a town-wide or even statewide scale. So what we're trying to do is try to figure out ways where we can manage ticks that don't fly in a similar capacity so that we can reduce public health over an area, say the size of the town of Guilford or Brantford or something along that scale. So that's what we're attempting to do. But at the same time, we're worried about impacts to pollinators, butterflies, beneficial insects that feed birds, that feed our native wildlife here in Connecticut. So as you'll see in my talk here, we're using some of these pesticides, and unfortunately, because ticks are so stubborn and difficult to kill, that we know it works to kill them. But some of the some of the more benefit the botanicals and so forth, some of them have tick killing capacity, but the majority of them are just for the most part repellents. So anyway, the field has come back around to using some of these synthetic products that are very effective at killing ticks, but we're doing it in a much targeted way that uses less spray. It's less toxic. It's more targeted instead of sort of a blanket spraying periodically throughout your yard. So the theme through my research and CDC's research, my research is largely funded by CDC. So these times are a little trying since the new administration took office, but we're fingers crossed that ticks are kind of apolitical, and I think everyone can agree that we don't like ticks. So I don't think it matters which side of the aisle you're on. I think we can all agree that ticks and tick-borne illness in humans is something that we don't want. So I feel somewhat relieved in that regard. But anyhow, so so I'll talk to you a little bit about what our research is and highlight some of our stuff along those same themes about less pesticide usage and being beneficial to the environment, with being cognizant of pollinators and beneficial insects, again, that are part of our food web that feed the birds that Audubon so loves, and up the trophic chain from there. So let's see if I can figure out how to share my screen here. Give me one sec. Sorry, I'm dealing with multiple screens here. We got it? Good. I can't. I assume we're good. So anyhow, I'll my title of my talk, if you can see it, if not, let me know, is vector control. Here's my information. As Dennis mentioned, I've been working at the Ag Station for almost 25 years now, and I'm currently the department head of environmental science and forestry, where I do some forestry work as well as tick work. Anyhow, throughout the Northeast, we all know what ticks are. We're all been exposed to them, no doubt. This audience is largely an outdoor audience, and most likely have had ticks on you. And our work here isn't to scare people, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here about getting outdoors, but it's more to educate folks about what to expect when you are outdoors, so you can be aware of these ticks and know what to look for, or what time of year is more of concern than other times of the year, and that ticks have different stages and different species and different they carry different pathogens and so forth. But in the Northeast, believe it or not, there's 10 to 16 different species of tick, 5 of which are of major concern, largely because they transmit various pathogens. But those are black-legged ticks, also known as the deer tick, Ixodes scapularis, and that's the big one we're most worried about here, and that probably we have most frequently here in Connecticut. Dog ticks, they're the larger ones you can feel scampering across your arm or your leg, and those are very conspicuous, and they're of concern a little bit, but not too much. Lone star tick, you can see it's namesake for the female there that has that lone star on its abdomen there, I believe it's called. And I should mention, I'm not an entomologist by training, so I just pretend to know a thing or two about ticks. I know more about their ecology than their morphology. But anyhow, Lone Star ticks are a native tick to the south and southeast that are moving northward because our winters are permitting them to do so. Cold temperatures, very cold temperatures, are what restricted their northward movement previously, but now we're seeing them. There's an established population in Norwalk. We've picked a few up in Guilford. We're picking some up in Groton. They're well established on Montauk, Fire Island, up through Prudence Island, Narragansett Bay, Cape Cod, the islands, and so forth. So in time, I think we'll see a more inland invasion of this species, which is a sort of a nuisance biting. But this one is the carrier of the red meat allergy. If you haven't heard of that, I can talk about that later. Another tick that's doing similar range expansion is the Gulf Coast tick. I don't know a lot about this one. This one really isn't human biting so much, nor is the Asian longhorn tick. Gulf Coast tick is one that's, a southeastern tick as well, native, that's moving northward. Asian longhorn tick came over, I think, in 2017, 2018. And that's obviously from Asia and is a nuisance tick, invasive tick here, and feeds primarily on livestock. Isn't really of human concern, but females of that species can regenerate without males, so they're parthenogenic. So that one can just really explode into high numbers very quickly.
Scott, let me
Yes.
interrupt you for a sec. Can you you're in edit mode right now. Can you go to slideshow mode?
Sure. I find I have some problem with that, but I can do so. Let's see.
There we go. Perfect.
Is that better?
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah. And this is some older data, but at the Ag Station, we have a passive tick surveillance program in which members of the public who are bitten by a tick can send that tick in to our labs and have them identified. And if they have a blood meal present in them, that blood meal can be, the tick itself can be screened for the presence of various pathogens and so forth. So this is just the species of ticks that have come through. So you can see in the blue here, let's see, give me 1 second. Yeah, blue right here is the majority of ticks that come through, and that's the black-legged or deer tick. 78% come through. So as I mentioned, that's the one of most concern and largest abundance here in Connecticut. Dog ticks, this orange, represent about 15% of submissions. Lone Star ticks is this gray piece of the pie, and that's about 6.5% or 6.3. And then this small sliver is other species, and the interest lies in these 16 ticks that come through, because often they're random anomalous ticks that come in from Africa or from other foreign places where people return and find this tick on them, and they're not quite sure what it is and what to do. So they submit it to us, and it's fairly challenging to identify some of these, but anyhow, it gives you an idea of the makeup, and this is pretty accurate for what we see in the landscape. Now I'm not able to advance. Oh, here we go. So this is a map put out by CDC, and in the blue here is for every county in which there was a documented Lyme disease case, they put a dot. So you can see back in 1996, over here in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, we had some, a little bit of a hot spot over there. And obviously Connecticut here and New Jersey, mid-Atlantic is the ultimate hot spot where Lyme disease is blowing up. And then you can see 22 years later, it's throughout the mid-Atlantic, going up into Maine. Midwest is becoming problematic here. Massachusetts does have plenty of ticks, but they have some reporting issues, so it doesn't show up there. But you can safe to say that Massachusetts will be all blue. And then this is the CDC map here. The red is where ticks have been confirmed established, and the yellows presumed range. So in time, this area would get all red, and this in the next couple of years or decade, that blob, we will no longer see a Midwestern blob. It's all going to be one amalgamous blob, including Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, and so forth. So the problem's just getting worse. And then this is graphically illustrating something similar, where we have number of reported cases starting with 10,000 or so in 1992, and then through COVID, which messed up reporting here. So we see a little bit of a hiccup here. But you can see this sort of explosive growth in number of reported cases from 10,000 in 92 to well over 40,000 in 2018. And this is an underestimate. It's estimated that about 10% of cases are actually reported. So you can do a correction factor, and there's upwards of quick math, 200, 250,000 or something along those lines. 300,000 cases annually. Don't quote me on that, but like I said, you can do the math. Only about 10% of cases are reported. And one way we handle ticks and tick management is through integrated tick management. So it's not just sort of a silver bullet strategy, but integrated tick management pursues the optimized use of compatible methods to manage pests in a way that is safe, economically viable, and environmentally sustainable. So it takes into account proper use of some of these pesticides. And what this definition doesn't really say is we attack different stages and different species of wildlife we know are feeding on these, instead of just say spraying or treating deer or this rodent bait box. But we can use these things in a smart, strategic way, such that we're treating the various stages of tick with their various hosts at various times of the year. I should mention that ticks have multiple stages. First, they're an egg, then they hatch into a larva, which is very small, say in August around our area of the country. And they don't carry any pathogens. The larva gets a blood meal, typically on a mouse or a bird or something that lives close to the ground, becomes a nymph, and that nymph overwinters. I believe this is a nymph here on this person's thumb here. This is an adult female deer tick. And then the nymphs overwinter, feed in the May, June, and then they become adults, and the adults find each other, typically on a deer. They mate, and the females fall off, lay eggs, and the whole cycle repeats itself. It's a 2-year life cycle. Some individual methods for integrated tick management includes education behavioral changes, and that's something like this playscape here where your kids are. If you have it close to the woods, this is very ticky habitat, this edge habitat, and this is a wood chip layer we'll talk about later. But placing this playscape more in the center part of the yard where the kids aren't going to be tempted to go chase the ball or something into this tick habitat, something of that nature. Personal protective measures. There's some great clothing lines now that I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with that you can buy that are impregnated with permethrin and offer excellent protection against ticks because the clothing is treated, good for up to 50 or 70 washes. The treated socks are phenomenal. So I take the treated socks, I wear them, and I pull them up over my pants, and ticks aren't only repelled from it, but if they're exposed long enough to the treated clothing, they will ultimately die. Landscape modifications include brush control, mowing your lawn, things of that nature. Chemical control is pretty obvious, various sprays. Biological control can be from introducing a host parasite, which isn't really all that effective, or dealing with hosts and their anyway. Or there's a fungal sprays we can use that adhere to tick cuticles that multiply and overwhelm and kill the tick that way. Anyhow, there's options there. Host reduction and or exclusion. This is pretty much restricted to white-tailed deer. There's studies have shown if you fence off an area or reduce deer very substantially, you can have an impact on ticks. But typically, deer need to be reduced down to single-digit densities per square mile, which it's extraordinarily low to have an impact on positive impact on tick abundances. And then there's host-targeted acaricides, meaning like this is a 4-poster device where the deer come in to feed, and on these paint rollers are an acaricide is a pesticide that kills arachnids or ticks in this case. And these deer come in to feed, and we put these feeders out when we know the adults are feeding on the deer. They roll these paint rollers onto their necks and the permethrin on there, and that kills ticks on these animals. And this is a rodent bait box in which is similar situation in which the rodents are attracted to a non-toxic bait within here, and in doing so, they get essentially frontlined with a fipronil, very, very low dose of fipronil as they come and go out of here, and that treats the ticks on them. This is a metal shroud that goes over this, and then obviously this is a pest control applicator spraying. Something we're going to talk about really briefly here is landscape modifications and chemical control. Then each of these I will discuss very briefly in this talk here today. First, all is a landscape modification. We got a grant from CDC. They wanted us to sample ticks in people's backyards and basically figure out which habitats in people's backyards are most conducive to tick survival and tick abundance, basically. The CDC, we got a grant to do it. And I think obviously CDC's interest is finding that critical habitat within these backyards where 90% of the ticks are, where you can treat this area so you're not spraying and exposing areas of the yard that don't need to be exposed, or putting product out on the landscape that doesn't need to be put out there. So my colleagues, Dr. Kirby Stafford, who's the tick guru in Connecticut, has recently retired from the Ag Station. I've kind of stepped into his role with the research aspect, and our late director, Dr. Lou Magnarelli, put out a paper years ago in which they found that about 82% of ticks are found from your lawn edge 3 meters into the woods. And it's that edge where 82% of the ticks on your property are found. So that's great. But if you think about the typical backyard on a 3, 4, 2-acre lot, that's a pretty long linear distance, and that whole area doesn't need to be sprayed. But within that, we can find some further unique habitats that lend themselves to tick survival, which is what we were charged with this research. So there isn't going to be a quiz on this or anything, but we looked at vegetable gardens, ornamental plantings, hardscapes like pea stone, pavers, that kind of thing, xeriscape, which is more like rocky desert plantings, a bird feeder. Bird feeders would attract birds and other hosts to it, rodents, deer probably. Woodpile would be a great place for mice to reside. Stone walls, same thing. Unmanaged area, meaning like letting grass grow out of control. The center portion of a wooded area with leaf litter, wood area along leaf litter with leaf litter along short grass ecotones, center portion of woody brushy area, and so on. And then we did leaf blown areas where we blew out areas and allowed down to bare soil in the fall prior to winter, and let just those leaves provide an insulated layer. So we wanted to push those out and let the ticks within there be just exposed to the winter elements. And that wood chip area we put along the edge of the lawn in some places. Anyway, so on and so forth. But it was pretty extensive, and we looked at all these, and we tick sampled. We dragged for ticks with a drag cloth behind us. But these were some of the ones where we found quite a few ticks in people's backyards. Again, it was dominated by that zone between just beyond your lawn into the wooded edge, kind of where you throw your lawn waste and your pet waste. Kind of in that zone is where you're going to find ticks. So when you're dragging brush into your woods where it's just out of sight from the lawn, you are in the tick zone. That's exactly where that is. And we do step in a lot of dog waste while we're doing our work in people's backyards. But anyway, here's the wood chip barrier. This is more wood mulch. And ultimately what we found from this research is it really didn't do anything. So ticks don't really migrate across horizontally. So it really doesn't do anything. The thought is it would provide like a dry, deserty environment, and they dry out as they're trying to cross this, versus leaf litter or grass. But because they don't, black-legged ticks anyway, don't travel this way, it's more of a reminder, I think, to folks, to homeowners, that once you cross that barrier, that chip barrier, you're in tick habitat. So it's kind of a demarcation, if you will. Like I said, if you're dragging brush or going to chase a soccer ball or something, and you cross this line, it may remind you to do a quick tick check thereafter. It doesn't really prevent ticks from migrating, because they come across on deer, on raccoons, on foxes, on birds, or whatever that can hop across that line in just a step or two. So the literature has shown that this is effective, and I think CDC wanted to verify that it still is effective or that it's not effective. So we found, anyway, I've kind of gone through this. Not all evidence. But anyhow, so we find that this wasn't a very sexy research topic, but it was, but it got a lot of press and people were excited about it. And I think people could relate to these different habitats in their own backyard. So it was highlighted in the Entomological Society of America's blog post. A lot of media outlets picked it up about this time last year. Anyhow, it was, and so we recently wrote a paper. My colleague, Dr. Megan Linsky, and she wrote the paper on this research evaluation of landscaping and vegetation management to suppress host-seeking Ixodes scapularis nymphs on residential properties in Connecticut. And this took place in Guilford, and was funded by the CDC. And if you're interested, you can scan this QR code and it'll bring you to our paper. If not, you can always contact me and I can provide you with it. And some work I did a while ago. So moving on from backyard habitats, but this is somewhat related, is black-legged tick association with invasive. So my former boss and I did this work back in 2007 to about 2017, 2018. And we found a positive association with Japanese barberry and black-legged ticks. I think if you've been in the woods in Connecticut, you know what Japanese barberry is. It's an escaped ornamental that was actually brought here in the late 1800s from Japan, and has since escaped cultivation and is found throughout the woods. Our post-ag landscape with the soil horizons got mixed up by these cloven-hoofed livestock, and it really lends itself to invasive invasions, particularly Japanese barberry. So we found that there were dramatic increases in tick abundance in these Japanese barberry stands. And we found that where we managed the barberry through flame weeding, through chemical, through mechanical methods, we were able to reduce both ticks and Borrelia infection down to rival those areas where these invasives weren't present. Borrelia is the agent that causes Lyme disease in people that the ticks carry. So the ticks don't carry Lyme disease; they carry Borrelia that causes Lyme disease in people. And we were trying to figure out why barberry was good habitat. It wasn't, there weren't more mice in there. The deer don't really prefer it. And what we discovered was that it is provides a mid canopy under the shaded canopy of the forest. So it's a very humid microclimate. And ticks are very prone to desiccation. So if it's humid through the majority of the day, they can be out seeking a host and be more successful in finding a host and reproducing than ticks that are not in such a humid microclimate. If that makes sense. And we've published multiple papers on this over the years. Again, if you're interested in this work, you feel free to contact me. I'll have my email at the end of the presentation, or Dennis has my email as well. On to chemical control. So I mentioned earlier some of the strategies we're using, one of which is a fall application of a acaricide or tick spray. Right now, the industry stand. You can see our colleague Jamie here. She's with our. You can see it's fall. The leaves are down. It's likely post frost is when we try to do it. So the thought here is that at this time of year, native pollinators have gone subterranean or dormant, or things like monarchs have migrated south. So there's very little. There's insect activity, yes, but much reduced insect activity at this time of year than there is, say, in the spring, when the people traditionally spray for ticks now. But in the spring, everything's emerging, everything's pupating, everything's coming out. So while you're treating for ticks, you're also likely killing a bunch of other insects with these synthetic pesticides. So anyway, so we looked at fall application and we wanted to see how effective it was. So this took place in North Branford. So we had a bunch of houses involved, and we sprayed in the fall and the spring, and with various techniques and compared them. Let's see, what do I have here? Most of the current chemicals used for area-wide tick control are pyrethroid insecticides. They're highly toxic to bees, exposed directly to application or residues on blooming crops. Some botanical insecticides have been found to have toxic and sublethal effects on honeybees as well. So while honeybees, are essentially livestock and are raised as such here in Connecticut, we don't worry too much about them because they are livestock, but we worry about the native bees, of which there are dozens, if not hundreds, of different species, as well as other butterflies and so forth. So, as I mentioned previously, ticks, like invasive plants, are very difficult to kill. They've been around for millions of years. 150 million years, I think, was the oldest tick specimen found in amber, or 99 million years ago, something a long time ago. So they persist and do quite well. So we found these synthetic pyrethroids work very well. I've sort of covered all this less volume. So we're looking at less volume of these timing, as I mentioned, that fall spraying in targeted locations in those backyards that we mentioned in the first paper I was talking about. So as I mentioned, the industry standard is to spray them when the ticks are actively host seeking, and it's the nymphal stage that we're most worried about. They're the small ones. They're about the size of the period at the end of the sentence, and they're active in May and June, and that's when people are typically outside gardening, or have become active after being stuck indoors for so long. The weather's conducive, so it's just sort of a bad combination. But everything else, like I mentioned, butterflies and other pollinators are becoming active as well. So this product too was CDC funded, trying to figure out a timing component of this to avoid killing all the benefit, to kill ticks, but avoid killing the beneficial insects and native insects that are out there. So for this study, we used a synthetic pyrethroid that's available to homeowners. It's a product called Demand. You can get on Amazon. Any homeowner can buy it and use it. It's very low dose of lambda cyhalothrin, which is a synthetic pyrethroid. Very favorable safety margin with this product, but it's very good at killing ticks and other insects as well. As I mentioned, we sprayed in the spring at some houses. We sprayed in the late fall, and then the spring and the late fall at others. And we did a high pressure truck mounted spray rig, like you saw our colleague Jamie spraying in the previous slide, and a powered backpack blower. It's like a leaf blower with a big 3-gallon reservoir on top that sort of mists it out. And then we use that same powered backpack blower with a granular application that settles down into the leaf litter and hopefully gets down to where the ticks are instead of getting aerial. And we sample the properties for nymphal deer ticks and compare them to untreated properties. This is me spraying with the backpack rig, which is like I said, this leaf blower here, and then you have a 3-gallon reservoir of product up here. I'm a pretty big guy, and this thing really throws off your center of gravity and is extremely heavy. So take a leaf blower and add, what's 3 gallons? Another 25 pounds of liquid. And anyway, it's quite heavy, but it's good. You're mobile. You're able to get in people's backyards and spray, but it's somewhat limiting. And then here, this is our our truck mounted rig that I'm filling the backpack sprayer off of. This is a 100-gallon capacity with 300 foot of hose that we can get out and peel out. And the benefit of this is it's much higher volume, and we can spray at a farther distance than the backpack, which is more of a mist application. So what we found was the high pressure spray, this backpack rig here, and like you saw Jamie spraying previously, actually that and this one had multi-season impact when sprayed in the fall, meaning we sprayed it in the fall and we saw not only tick reduction in that fall at the time of spraying, but we saw tick reduction the following spring as well. So between those two, we found that the high pressure one was more effective at getting in the leaf litter. You have 300, 400 psi kicking the leaves up, and this product getting into the dirt where the ticks are overwintering underneath that leaf litter, just trying to stay hydrated and survive the winter. And so that was obviously very beneficial and a good thing. But the only downside was the high pressure rig does put more volume of product out, but anyway, it worked better than anything else. And one takeaway we had from this research was that ticks not need to be actively host seeking in order to be effectively managed. We have shown they can be targeted when they're not actively host seeking. So what we're trying to do is try to get the applicator industry, the landscapers and so forth, to get rid of this notion that you have to spray and treat for ticks when they're out and active. It's sort of a mosquito mentality, but mosquitoes have a much different life cycle. Ticks in the fall and winter are there. They're not looking to feed on people or animals, but they're there in the leaf litter, and they're able to be targeted. And with our research, we were able to show that this can happen. So we're presenting on this research now. We're hoping that people pick up on this and homeowners opt to treat their properties in the fall, both to benefit public health and kill ticks, but also to benefit native pollinators, insects, and so forth. So this is just, we're trying to shift. It's like steering a battleship, but we're trying to shift the train of thought into, we don't need to kill the ticks when everything else is active. We can kill the ticks when most stuff is inactive, but the ticks are still there. So again, this was CDC funded. This one got a lot of traction as well. This was very recently published, just last year. Into a little bit about host reduction. This is my colleague Megan, who's also from Guilford. That deer's very much alive. That was darted and sleeping. That's why it has the ear tags and the mask over its head. So we did some capture work to draw some blood samples and look at parasitizing tick abundances on them, which is always interesting. But anyway, deer populations exploded in the early 2000s here in Connecticut. There you couldn't worry about hitting deer. There are deer all over the road, dead. It was a collision risk, not only a health risk, but deer reduction as a component to ITM, integrated tick management, was investigated. And it's kind of a no-win situation with deer. People, you either love them or you hate them, and it's very polarizing opinions. There's many attempts to reduce deer to sufficient low enough densities to affect ticks, as I mentioned previously. It was hunters loved it. It gave them ample opportunity, but there was a disconnect between their goals and those of public health officials, meaning you can't tell a hunter to go out and drive deer in their areas basically into extinction to benefit others, because their hunters ultimately will resist. And you can't hunt deer across, say, the whole town of Guilford. You can only hunt on about 5 or 6% of the town where hunters have access. So while you can impact deer densities on those, say, 5 or 6% land area, there's still 95% of land area that's unhunted, where the deer proliferate and do just fine. So these efforts are very difficult, and we're kind of moving away from this pitfall laden strategy, as I call it, that can be very polarizing. Deer reduction, as it has been shown to be effective in insular locations. So this was a paper done, in 2000, I believe. This is an island off the coast of Maine, and it was ultimately published in 2004, where deer, I think in the 40s, a handful were released out there by some gentlemen for sporting opportunity, and of course they exploded. And our colleagues up in Maine did some work there and called in a professional sharpshooter, and he eliminated deer from the island, and they documented the impacts on ticks, which is quite interesting. And ticks ultimately crashed from very high numbers down to extremely low numbers with no deer host, but they did persist. And currently, I think ticks pop up periodically and are dropped off on the island by seabirds. And then we did some work down in Reading, Connecticut, that included a deer reduction component that was not very well received by the local hunting community. We were able to reduce deer somewhat, but ultimately it was I had to pull the plug and stop this component because there's so much resistance and active resistance by the hunting community down there. Not the animal rights folks, but the hunting community, which was curious. And then this is some of our very recent work. is the systemic acaricide treatment of white-tailed deer. I mentioned, sorry, I'm just trying to see what slides I have here. I probably should have started with this slide, but this is I mentioned it. This is the three-host tick life cycle, in which larvae here are born in summer and August, and then feed on pretty much anything that they can find. And let's see how this goes. They become a nymph in year one, and the nymphs overwinter, and then the nymphs come out, and they feed on typically deer, humans, what have you. There is really no size component of the host for both larval and nymphal stage here in the first year of life. But then when they become adults, after the nymph gets its blood meal in May or June and morphs into an adult, these adults do have a size requirement. So they typically feed on white-tailed deer. Something like 90% of fittingly deer ticks require a blood meal from an animal as large as white-tailed deer. So again, we know when they're going to be feeding on them, and we can target them directly. So this is that 4-poster device I mentioned, that these rollers here have permethrin on them. So when the deer come in to feed, they roll this on their neck, and it's a topical pesticide that in theory kills ticks. This has shown to work, but you're injecting hundreds of thousands of calories into the deer herd, which ultimately increases their health and makes more deer, which compounds the problem. So while this can work, and there's some strategies that we've published on that, trying to make this more effective by using less corn. But with these feeders here, it's a different style. This is a hopper. It's filled with corn. Deer can come and go as they please and feed all they want. This is a more Pavlovian response, in which this feeder is, say, set to spin at 6 o'clock p.m. The deer get trained after a while and start coming in at 9:45 because it only drops down about 5 pounds of corn, and it first come first serve if you're a deer. So there's pressure to come feed here. So if we can put a treated bait in here, we can use the deer's behavior and competition to our advantage. And while there's a non-target raccoon here feeding, we can limit non-target consumption of these treated baits that we're looking to feed to the deer, such that they're not being topically treated like in this 4-poster device, but they're ingesting product here, such that if a tick feeds on this animal anywhere, if it gets a blood meal from it, it will ingest the active ingredient and die. So this is very much like frontlining and treating your pets against ticks. Whereas this is, the animal's head and neck is getting treated, but that this product would then need to be translocated all the way to the hindquarters and throughout the rest of the animal to be effective, which doesn't always necessarily happen. So you can imagine concentrations are high in the head neck area and low, probably sublethal to the ticks back here in the hindquarter. Whereas if the tick takes the blood meal from the head, the groin, the rear hindquarters, or the leg of this animal, the active ingredients in the blood, and it should kill the tick. Just some of the big boys hanging out. So there is a dominance impact as well. So these big boys will dominate the sites and push away subordinate animals, which is problematic if you're trying to treat the entire herd. So again, if we put multiple feeders here, if there's intense competition at this feeder, these animals know there's a feeder or two not too far away where they can go experience less competition, and presumably we can treat a greater proportion of the herd. This animal is not dead. It was captured. Let's see, several springs ago or early summers ago. You can see the antlers are still in velvet. Ear tag here. This is we were doing the systemic work for Lone Star ticks, and their activity patterns are different than black-legged. So the adults and nymphal stages are active in May and June in these Lone Star ticks. So we did some capture work. We fed the treated product to the deer in those various feeders, did some capture work, took some blood samples from the animals, and we had those blood samples analyzed for active ingredient, and ultimately found that we were successful in getting product into these animals. Here we're applying ear tags, photographing the animal, documenting parasitizing tick burdens on the ears, and so forth. Oh, and this is just a funny picture because typically when you dart an animal over the corn, they jet off into this thick stuff and they succumb to the drugs in the thorniest, nastiest, wettest spot you can imagine. And very seldom are they so nonplussed by receiving a dart in the hindquarter do they turn around and come back to feed, only to collapse right below the feeder, as was the case with these two animals. So this was most fortunate. Ultimately, we found that 83% of our captured animals had, 5 to 8 parts per billion of that active ingredient in their system. So that was pretty dramatic. And we proved that they will consume the bait in necessary quantity for it to be effective. There's a lot more to this. I'm glancing over it pretty quickly. But again, this is if we can treat animals in this method at the proper time of year when we know the majority of adults are out and actively feeding on them, we could potentially kill ticks, at a town-wide scale, but it would be a large effort, but it could be done. Unfortunately, we're running into some problems because deer are a hunted species and can be consumed by humans, so the product we put into them also needs to be able to be consumed by humans. So it's sort of an evolving, adapting, evaluating these various strategies over time, and we're kind of optimizing them, and we're trying to figure out, habitats where the ticks are located most frequently. I'm trying to use less product, trying to target these animals and these ticks at seasons when we're not going to negatively impact native insect species, or trying not to increase health with these deer by feeding them thousands and thousands of calories and so forth. So this is all in the interest of public health, but there's a bunch of side effects that we got to be careful for and kind of bring it back to public health and, sustain our environment, reduce chemical that we're putting out there, and make it much more targeted such that we can improve public health without having too many negative impacts. Anyhow, that's what I've got. This is just some of our brochures that are available. We have a bunch of tick information on our webpage and available, but here's my contact information if you'd like to get in touch with me on anything that I covered. I covered a lot of stuff very briefly this evening, so I can expand on it a little bit. If you wanted to shoot me an email or give me a phone call or something along those lines. With that, I'm not sure how we proceed, but I'm happy to answer any tick-related questions, or let me see if I can get out of here, or answer questions in the chat that folks might have. I'm not sure how much time we have, but I'm happy to entertain questions.
We have about 15 minutes. Scott, I'll be putting contact information into a follow-up email tomorrow, so people can check in with you. Then there are some questions in the chat, so I'm going to call on people if you want to come off mute and ask your questions. Let's start with Patrick Phillips.
Yeah, I just have a question regarding a half-life of pyrethroid compounds. Did they break down over time?
Oh, that is a very good question. We are currently investigating. They do ultimately, but I'm not educated enough in this discipline to speak intelligently on it. So they do, but I'm not entirely sure how much so they do. And so we're actually investigating that with our fall application spray. So we're putting out our filter paper, we're spraying in the fall, and we're going to collect those filter papers at various intervals throughout the winter, have them analyzed to see how concentrated the active ingredient is at various times throughout the winter to answer that very question. So stay tuned, I suppose, is the answer to that one.
Great, thank you.
Susan on the iPad.
That's me. I had two questions that came up as we went along. The first was, how do ticks find us, do they drop out of trees? Do they have electrostatic means? I don't think they're just like, rubbing up against us all the time. And then my second one was that I recently saw a study where the chemical compounds in dog fur from flea and tick treatments was found in bird nests. And I was wondering if that's anything to be of concern, like a, accumulation kind of thing. So I'll unmute.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Your first question. Oh, geez, I'm already blanking. Oh, how do ticks find us? So black-legged ticks are passive obligate parasites. So that means they don't drop out of trees. They don't electrostatically jump on us. They're just sitting on pieces of vegetation waiting for something to go by. So it's called questing behavior. So they sit with their hind legs attached and their front legs out, and literally just hoping in the odd chance that something comes by. So that's why they're found in that transition zone between your yard and the forest, because that's where a lot of the wildlife like to go, on that edge habitat, and they're more apt to pick up a host there. So the majority of ticks probably don't even find a host and just perish and die. But there's so many of them on the landscape that a handful do find a host. That's black-legged ticks. Lone Star ticks can sense CO2 and can actually hunt people down, and they're people and their hosts, so they can sense the heat, and they actually can go toward them and find them and get a blood meal that way. And then your other question was about treated fur in birds' nests and bioaccumulation effects. So with treating mice and putting this stuff out in the environment, you do worry about bioaccumulation. So with a lot of these products, because you're only killing a tiny little tick, they can be so incredibly low dose that a bird of prey or a fox or something would have to consume 500 treated rodents in one night to have any impact. And if it did have an impact, it would likely clear that animal of parasites itself, if you permitted it to accumulate. So it's not really like, it's more medicating that we think of it as. And so bioaccumulation can have a positive impact too, but we obviously, we don't know all the impacts. But to your point about the dog hair and bird nests, there are also tick tubes that people might be familiar with that are like basically a toilet paper roll filled with treated cotton that are thrown out on the landscape that the mice come and pull and bring into their dens to use as bedding material, and it exposes themselves and their young to the active ingredients there, and it can kill ticks and can be effective. So these things can be a positive too. But with pets, where the frontline component, fipronil is the active ingredient, and it's 10% fipronil frontline. I don't know if folks use frontline anymore, but the fipronil that we're using in the field is 1,000 so it's 0.005% as opposed to 10%. So it's very, very low dose.
Lynn.
Yes, thank you. Great talk. I'm curious if the study areas that you use for measuring deer in the woods and not people's backyards are publicly available to hunters that might be hunting deer that are in those areas.
The deer we treated.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very good question. The ones we treated were isolated herds. So we treated one in Bridgeport and a fenced-in semi-captive herd, and another down in Norwalk. So they were semi-isolated, both within a somewhat contained area and also by urban development around them. So there was virtually no way that an animal could be consumed when we were treating them.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Marianne Conklin.
Yes, hello, and thank you for all this information. So I was just wondering if there's a particular company that is reducing the ticks that we should consider employing.
I don't know any offhand, and unfortunately, I really can't. As a state employee, I can't
Right.
recommend one over the other.
Yeah, I
But if
realize
you
that.
call any of them, they will. These landscaping companies, if they have a spray rig, they're like a huge component of their base is tick spraying. So I'm sure you can, and you can speak to them, and they can recommend a spray for you that works for you. Some of these botanical ones, as I mentioned, are repellent and can keep ticks at bay if that's what you're into. But it would require multiple applications every couple of weeks to keep them at bay. Or you could use a more targeted pyrethroid spray that would actually kill them.
Mhm.
If you speak to a lot of these or your neighbors, I know there's tick guy and tick ranger. I see signs around, and
Right.
there's some that are specific to ticks themselves, but I'm not sure if they picked up on any of our research that we're promoting quite yet. So it could be up to folks like yourself to educate some of these companies to maybe institute some of our practices.
Okay.
And we're just starting to get the word out on some of these things now.
Yeah, I have asked for, they have something like organic or something, so I asked for that. I think you said in your presentation that may be less effective.
So right, so there are organic and botanical ones. Again, they're mostly repellents and just sort of keep them at bay and prevent them from coming onto your property. But there are some botanicals that are acaricides too that will kill ticks as well. And we're working as a subcontractor on a company looking at just that, looking at the lethality of some of these botanical compounds. So there's a lot of different avenues of research looking at effective tick sprays that are effective at killing ticks, increasing public health, decreasing public health risk, and also environmentally friendly. So there's multiple avenues that are being explored currently.
Thank you very much.
Kathy.
Hi, yeah, thank you for your interesting presentation. I had a question about your findings with the invasive barberry and its high association with ticks. And I was wondering if it was associated with it. I think you said because of the high humidity environment that it created. And I was wondering if you were able to dissociate that from those large stands of thick brush just hosting large amounts of mice colonies, and if that might have contributed. That's the humidity.
So for 10 years, we trapped mice in the areas where we managed barberry, in areas where we didn't manage barberry, in areas where barberry was absent. And ultimately we found there was no difference in mouse abundance between the three. So mice are kind of habitat generalists and are ubiquitous across the landscape, and their populations fluctuate year to year to year, basically based on acorn abundance largely. But we thought it was mouse abundance, and maybe that they were living in the barberry and it prevented birds of prey and foxes and other predators from getting in there. But ultimately we found there was no difference. So we found that mice weren't a component. But we put out temperature and relative humidity sensors, and we ultimately found that the humidity component was most likely the reason they were surviving so well.
So maybe other places that have a similar humidity profile.
Correct. So it's not specific to Japanese barberry necessarily, but it's more its growth form. So like you say, a brush pile or dense vegetation of some other kind could create those same humid microclimate environments. We got a lot of questions. Did we look at, ferns, or did we look at stilt grass or any of those? And no, we looked at barberry, but it doesn't mean that mechanism can't function in the presence of other invasives or native plants as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, good question.
Anybody else have a question? I guess not. So thank you, Scott. Thank you very much.
I have one real quick. Is it cold enough to kill him tonight?
This is a they need very cold, dry conditions. So maybe that with little snow. So we had that cold snap in early January where it was cold and windy and low humidity. That's what you really need to kill ticks. So maybe not tonight, but some of those cold, dry, where you get that dry wind whipping through and sucking all the humidity out of things is what you're, with no snow, is what you're really looking for. So maybe that snap we had in early January could put a hurting on them, but we won't know till spring.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I do have a question, Scott, and that relates to Lyme disease. Is it increasing or decreasing or?
Cases seem to be increasing. I'm not sure what like I said, COVID kind of threw everything into a loop with recording, and we're just kind of recovering from that. Now we had a good trajectory prior to that. And now we have that interruption in the data. So we're trying to make sense of that. Mm-hmm. But it's, for the most part, increasing on that exponential curve that you saw. And yeah, it's not getting any better. So unfortunately, so there are human vaccine trials that are in their later stages of development that may be coming out soon if they're not out already. But it's, like I said, we're not trying to scare people indoors with this, but we're just trying to educate folks on this and what to look for and when to look for it. And if you're experiencing any odd symptoms, I feel like in Connecticut, and if you're outdoorsy and out and about, like I presume this audience is, the first thing we should go do is look for tick-borne illness and and bring it to your doctor's attention. And it's simple as a blood test, and then then eliminate that as the cause, and then you can move forward from there. But it's, when you're living in a tick country like we do, that's got to be the first thing on your mind, especially if you're outdoor focused, like I imagine this group is.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thanks, Scott, and thank you all for joining us this evening. Have a good couple of weeks before we take a look at bird migration. Check the website for details and to sign up for the programs. So thanks, everybody, and good night.
Thank you.